Some time ago, I published a pair of articles on Martin Harris's February 1828 journey to Columbia College and his visit with those whom I called the three wise men of the East, Charles Anthon, Samuel Mitchell, and Luther Bradish, all in connection with the so-called Anthon transcript. The purpose of my paper today is to expand upon my earlier findings and to add new insights into the origins and purpose of Harris's trip to Albany and New York City. Furthermore, while I will elaborate somewhat upon our understanding of Anthon and Mitchell, my primary intention is to focus on the one wise man Harris may have known best, Luther Bradish, Esquire. I intend to offer additional reasons for why it was that this well-known adopted son of Palmyra, who had already earned an international reputation for diplomacy, was best situated to understand and assist Harris in his attempt to finance the printing of the Book of Mormon. I will conclude by offering a new hypothesis, a tantalizing theory, which, though definitely unproven, might invite comment and encourage further research. The outlines of our story are well known. Working with the gold plates and the Urim and Thummim, Joseph Smith had begun the work of early translating in late 1827 from the Reformed Egyptian language found in the Book of Lehi, the large plates of Nephi. Early on, he transcribed some of the characters from those plates as a sort of working alphabet or reference guide. At this time, his primary scribe was Martin Harris himself, a well-known and respected Palmyra farmer, an early and keen supporter of Joseph Smith's work, and destined to become one of the later three witnesses to the Book of Mormon. For a variety of reasons, not the least of which was to keep peace at home with his wife Lucy, who resented her husband's growing involvement with Joseph Smith, Harris begged leave to take a transcription of the characters Smith had made to New York City, as historian B.H. Roberts wrote, to submit them to men of learning for their inspection. Roberts says that Harris submitted two papers containing different transcripts to Professors Anthon and Mitchell of New York, one that was translated and one not translated. My earlier presumption was that Harris went east because he wanted scholarly validation or independent corroboration. There may be, however, more to the story. If what Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, remembered is accurate, Joseph directed Harris to make his fact-finding mission. The first step that he was instructed to take in regard to this work was to make a facsimile of the characters composing the alphabet, which were called Egyptian, and send them to all the most learned men of this generation, and ask them for the translation of the same. And it would also appear that Martin Harris had received his own independent corroborative inspiration to undertake the trip. And because of his faith and this righteous deed, the Lord appeared unto him in a vision and showed unto him his marvelous work which he was about to do. And he immediately came to Susquehanna and said the Lord had shown him that he must go to New York City with some of the characters. And so we proceeded to copy some of them. And he took his journey to the eastern cities. Perhaps there was then as much compliance as there was corroboration involved in Harris's making the trip. Not only was Harris directed to make the trip, but Lucy's account even makes provision for precisely what kind of expertise Harris should seek after. It was agreed upon that Martin Harris should follow him as soon as Joseph should have sufficient time to transcribe some of the Egyptian characters. Then Mr. Harris was to take the characters to the east and through the country in every direction. And on his way, he was to call on all who were professed linguists to give them an opportunity of showing their talents in giving a translation of the characters. Thus, Harris was directed to make his trip east, either in vision or by Joseph himself, or both. Furthermore, that he was to go in every direction. And finally, he was to seek out those linguists who might lend verification to the validity of the characters. Nowhere in the records, however, was Harris told precisely which linguists he was to see. How would he have known who to see? In the absence of any names offered by Joseph Smith or anyone else, we are left to conclude that Harris was to make those decisions himself. It now makes perfect sense that, as both John H. Gilbert and Pomeroy Tucker attest, Harris would have first visited Luther Bradish in February 1828 in Albany on his way down to New York City. Luther Bradish was a lawyer, linguist, diplomat, and statesman. Born in Massachusetts, he had attended school at Williams College, and after a short stint as a teacher, he entered the legal profession and became an early Wall Street lawyer. When his first wife, Helen, died in childbirth in 1816, along with their stillborn son, Bradish went overseas on a delicate diplomatic mission. On his return to America in 1825, he moved to Moira, Franklin County, where he bought large parcels of land and was elected state assemblyman in 1838 and again in 1840. In that year, he was elected lieutenant governor of New York on the Whig ticket with Governor William Seward. In 1839, he married his second wife, Mary Hart of New York City, by whom he had a daughter. In 1842, he ran unsuccessfully for governor, and later he was appointed United States Assistant Treasurer for the state of New York, president of the American Bible Society and of the New York Historical Association. Bradish would die in Newport, Rhode Island in 1863. The first reason Harris visited Bradish was that, if not close friends, the two men would have known each other fairly well. From my earlier research, we learned that the Bradish and Harris families had been very well acquainted with one another since before the turn of the 19th century. Their fathers, Nathan Harris and John Bradish Jr., had worked as local highway commissioners together, and both were well respected in the Palmyra community. Furthermore, Martin Harris and Luther's brothers, Charles and Calvin, were also road commissioners in Palmyra and overseers together. Although Luther spent much of his growing up years at school in Massachusetts, he had lived in Palmyra, a city not all that large, in 1804, 1805, again in 1815, 1817, and much of 1819. The Bradish family were well-known Episcopalians, and his two sisters married well, one to a pioneer doctor in Palmyra, and the other to a very early and successful Palmyra attorney. His brother, Charles, resided in nearby Macedon. In 1825, Luther's father, John, died, and in December 1828, his mother, Hannah Bradish, passed away. Both are buried in Palmyra. As one of his Palmyra nephews put it, as late as 1835, "You, Luther, have some dear friends here who would give you a cordial welcome," if he were to sell his land holdings in Moira County and move to Palmyra. It is reasonable to conclude, therefore, that Harris and Luther had crossed paths before. In other words, Bradish may have found a soft and friendly first stop for Harris on his trip east, someone who might direct him on who else to see. Furthermore, Luther was a very successful lawyer, and by this time had become a man of means, one sought after by many others, several from Palmyra. For instance, not long before Harris's visit, the local Palmyra Episcopalian priest, the Reverend Joseph Colt, had asked Bradish for money to help build a new and bigger church. "Your known wealth and your numerous connections here warrant me in saying that should you feel disposed to invest $50 or $100 in our building, you would be a particular service to a few here who are exerting all their energy and means to erect a house for the worship of Almighty God." Bradish was also very familiar with the local Palmyra economy. Having been elected to the New York State Assembly, Bradish was already lending his support to Palmyra's petition to charter a local bank. We also know that he knew the Grandin family and counseled them on financial matters. We now know that the year after Harris visited Bradish, 1829, was a particularly difficult one economically for Ontario County, much worse than the year previous, because of poor crops brought on by an early harsh winter. In a letter dated simply April 1829, C.C. Robinson, one of Luther's nephews in Palmyra, told of the town's straitened financial circumstances. Our crops having been cut off, it has caused a perfect dearth. Such a time has not been known or felt by us at the present for money. Last season we could make our collections with ease, but not so far this. Money appears to be out of the question. Thus Martin Harris's, pressed for means, Robinson did what many others had done. He asked Bradish for money, in his case for a loan of $1,000. Thus Martin Harris's financial sacrifices for the printing of the Book of Mormon could not have come at a worse time economically in Palmyra, and says more about his commitment to Joseph Smith's translation than perhaps we have previously recognized. If it seems likely Harris was also looking for a financial partner, and not just the statements of a linguist, he was clearly seeing the right man. By the time Harris arrived in Albany, and probably before, he would in all likelihood have known of Bradish's labors in Egypt. Without rehearsing all the pertinent details from my earlier study, suffice it here to say that Bradish had been in the Middle East from 1819 to 1825 as a special envoy of John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, and knew all about the War of the Consuls between Great Britain and France. Bradish also knew fairly well several key archaeologists and temple raiders on both sides of the Nile during that conflict, and who were then excavating and removing all kinds of Egyptian treasures and artifacts. Bradish himself was instrumental in shipping to America several small Egyptian artifacts of his own, some to New York, others to Philadelphia. During his stay in the Middle East, Bradish had also become conversant with several of the native languages in the region, at least well enough to get by, and had become familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphs, which were, of course, finally deciphered by that brilliant French linguist Jean-François Champollion in 1820 from his work on the famed Rosetta Stone. Bradish was conversant enough in German and Arabic that many others referred to him as a linguist, which alone was reason sufficient for Harris to seek him out. No other living American that I know of, and certainly no other acquaintance of Martin Harris, was more conversant with contemporary Egyptian discoveries and, at least to some rudimentary extent, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs than was Luther Bradish. Yet another reason for Bradish is that why Harris visited Bradish is that he knew New York City well and was acquainted with many of its most illustrious citizens. Most importantly for this study, he knew Professor Samuel Mitchell, and in all likelihood was responsible for pointing his Palmyra friend in the direction of the man who many believed was the greatest living American naturalist. A Quaker from birth who was rather short and inclining to corpulency, full-faced with a large double chin and a pleasant open countenance, Mitchell in 1824 was 64 years old, then nearing the end of his illustrious career. He is regarded by presidents and paupers, farmers and fishermen as one of America's greatest scholars. A friend of James Madison and an avid supporter of Jefferson's policies, Mitchell dined often with the president, earned his trust and respect as a naturalist. As chairman of the Select Committee of Congress, he had worked hard to gain financial support for the Louisiana Purchase and encouraged plans to explore the American West. Jefferson even sent to Mitchell and the American Philosophical Society, of which Mitchell was an honored member, several new specimens of flora and fauna which had been forwarded to him by Lewis and Clark during their famous explorations westward. Mitchell was also well known for his famous collections of specimens of plants, seeds, animals from all over the world. It seems his scientific interest knew no bounds, as one scholar put it. His furious rate of publication never abated. A member of 49 different learned societies in 11 countries, he authored several books and scores of articles. And by the time he died in 1831, he had earned the plaudits of the great and the small. John Randolph called him a chaos of knowledge. He was known among his colleagues as the Nestor of American science, a stalking library, the Delphic Oracle of New York, and even President Thomas Jefferson referred to him as the Congressional Dictionary. Unlike the meeting between Harris and Bradish, we now do know the nature of the conversation between Harris and Mitchell. From an article written in 1831 by a newspaper reporter, James Gordon Bennett, and published in the New York Morning Courier and Enquirer, we learn that Harris first met with Anthon and then later with Mitchell. And here I'm quoting from, let's see, do I have it here? Yes. Said Charles Anthon to Harris, "Mr. Harris, you had better go to the celebrated Dr. Mitchell and show them to him. He is very learned in these languages, and I have no doubt will be able to give you some satisfaction." "Where does he live?" asked Harris. He was told, and off he posted with the engravings from the golden plates to submit to Dr. Mitchell. Harris says that the doctor received him very politely, looked at his engravings, made a learned dissertation on them, compared them with the hieroglyphics discovered by Champollion in Egypt, and set them down as the language of a people formerly in existence in the East, but now no more. Whether Harris saw Mitchell first or last, it is clear that Anthon was in 1828 merely starting out in his career. And although a brilliant classicist, he knew next to nothing about Egyptian, ancient or modern, and that he was speaking beyond the level of his current knowledge. In a fascinating new, recently discovered Anthon account, he admits in a sort of backhanded way that he was a classicist and a linguist, though not one then familiar with ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. By 1844, he was well aware that Mormon missionaries were using his transcript story to obtain new converts, and he was anxious to play down the excesses of what some were then implying he had once said. Of one thing, however, I am very sure, that I never professed to be acquainted with the vast number of languages which the Mormons speak. The truth is, in 1828, his first love was the classics, especially the works of Homer, Herodotus. And while he knew Greek, Latin, German, and French fluently, there's little indication he knew much about Egyptian or any other Middle Eastern language. My contention is that while Anthon's comments about not being able to read a sealed book were later fastened on by Mormon missionaries as fulfillment of Isaiah's ancient prophecies, it was Luther Bradish and Samuel Mitchell who offered more support and corroboration to Harris in his quest to support the eventual publication of the Book of Mormon. And now to my hypothesis. There remains yet another compelling reason why Harris might have been interested in seeing Bradish. Bradish knew the book trade. By 1828, he had formed very active connections with the best publishing houses in the country and had been for some time the literary agent for one of America's best known authors, James Fenimore Cooper. He also knew Washington Irving well. By way of a short review, James Fenimore Cooper was then a rising voice in American historical romantic novels of frontier and Indian life in early America. He had published his first novel, Precaution, in 1820. His next novel, The Spy, came out in 1821. And after writing The Pilot and Lionel Lincoln, he published arguably his greatest work, The Last of the Mohicans, with Carey and Isaac Lee, publishers of Philadelphia. His Deerslayer, published many years later, completed his Leatherstocking Tales and established his reputation as America's most successful imitator of Sir Walter Scott. Cooper also wrote Stirring Sea Tales, various political confessions of faith in the history of the United States Navy. Soon after returning from Egypt, Carey and Lee publishers approached Bradish to write a book detailing his exciting sojourns in the Middle East. Bradish never complied, but in the process formed a strong friendship and working relationship with Cooper, becoming one of his literary agents as early as 1826. Cooper was then writing in France and needed Bradish to negotiate contracts for him with Carey and Lee and perhaps other American publishing houses. As literary agent for one of the best-known up-and-coming American authors, Bradish was a man of trust, someone who both author and publisher could depend on. The American publishing industry, which then lagged far behind its British counterparts in size, influence, and readership, had become an exceedingly hungry, competitive, and cutthroat enterprise. Stories abound of how upstarts, New York publishers were undermining Carey and Lee and other Philadelphia publishers by pirating British and overseas authors' manuscripts as they arrived in installments on board packet ships in New York Harbor. And aware that American works could be made more profitable than ever before, these same publishers were anxious to try to develop a group of native-born American authors and had begun to publish books by American authors in medicine, law, religion, travel, and science. Competition was becoming very keen, and unscrupulous agents could often be bought out by the highest bidder. As Carey and Lee said in a letter to Bradish in 1827, how dangerous it is to trust a new book in the hands of anyone unless it's almost perfect. There is so much desire to show an acquaintance with what is generally known that it's hardly possible for anyone to keep to himself. And if there be faults, they are almost certain to be made known. In the matter of Cooper's The Prairie, Bradish successfully secured all installments for Carey and Lee, receiving their heartfelt commendation in the process. We know perfectly well you would not put it in the hands of anyone else. Trusted and respected, Bradish negotiated a contract of $4,500 with Lee and Carey for Cooper's next book, The Red Rover, published in 1827. Thus, Bradish knew the book trade, and both author and publisher knew and respected him as a man of integrity. So in conclusion, my hypothesis is a simple one. Only 4 months after Harris had shown Bradish, Anthon and Mitchell the transcript, he and Joseph Smith had finished translating 116 pages of manuscript. Against his better judgment, Joseph had turned the manuscript over to Harris. And after he had shown the transcript to those who were privileged to see it, according to his oath, he laid it aside. And then, one day, a very particular friend made him a visit to whom he related all he knew concerning the record. Lucy's account says further, the man's curiosity was much excited, and he earnestly desired to see the transcript. Martin was anxious to gratify his friend, and as we all know, the rest is lost history. Whoever that particular friend was, I am persuaded that he was no mere acquaintance, but someone Harris knew well, regarded so very highly that he was willing to break his oath in the hopes of perhaps gaining some real assistance in return. Someone who could have helped with the entire enterprise. Someone of means. Someone trusted in the community by almost everyone, including the Grandins. And someone who would have lent almost instant credibility to the story of the Golden Bible. And if Harris was thinking of a possible publisher, and this at a time when American publishers were avidly looking for manuscripts, even partial manuscripts, who better than the man he had shown the transcript to earlier in the year? A man who would have been keenly interested in the progress Harris had made on the work in just a few months' time. Let me not overstate myself. We do not know who Harris showed the manuscript to that spring of 1828. We may never know. We do not know if, for instance, the British was even in Palmyra in 1828. However, it's likely he was. Considering the fact that his mother was ailing and would die later that year, it's reasonable to suppose that he may have been in Palmyra at least once or twice that year. Still, for his part, Bradish would have tread very carefully in supporting the publication of a Gold Bible. A confirmed Episcopalian, he had a faith to live by and a reputation to uphold. How would it have looked for an aspiring, successful young politician to outwardly support such a strange endeavor in a town that looked askance at Joseph Smith's proclamations? Certainly there is no evidence whatsoever at the present time that Bradish even hinted at supporting Harris. Still, the circumstances, I believe, are worthy of further study. Martin Harris's trip in 1828 is an important chapter in early Mormon history. Though Harris clearly was seeking corroboration and validation, the trip was made as much out of obedience to Joseph Smith's invitation and perhaps in compliance to divine inspiration. And while instructed to seek out linguists in every direction, Harris was on his own in choosing who to see. Evidence has been here presented to show why he first saw Luther Bradish in the state capitol on his way to New York, and also what Samuel Mitchell and Charles Anthon later said to him. Both rebuffed and confirmed, Harris ultimately returned to Palmyra more willing than ever before to financially support the printing of the Book of Mormon. The fact that he did so in 1829, which was a time of economic depression and restraint in the region, is even further evidence of his keen support of Joseph Smith's endeavors. And finally, did Harris later show the 116-page manuscript to his very particular friend? It's tantalizing to speculate, but only time and much further research will tell us the rest of the story. Thank you.